In 1982, a 5-year-old girl named Clara Whitmore vanished while walking home from her grandmother's house. No trace, no witnesses, no ransom, just gone. But 83 years later, long after everyone who loved her had passed away, a DNA test revealed something no one could explain. It was October 14, 1982, in Millbrook, Pennsylvania, a quiet, working-class town where everyone knew everyone. The kind of place where people left their doors unlocked and children played outside until the streetlights came on. Clara Whitmore was one of those children. Bright blue eyes, blonde pigtails, and a smile that could light up a room. She loved drawing pictures of butterflies and singing songs she made up in her head. That afternoon, Clara had visited her grandmother, Martha Whitmore, who lived just 4 blocks away. It was a walk Clara had made dozens of times. Her grandmother had baked cookies, chocolate chip, Clara's favorite, and they'd spent the afternoon coloring and watching cartoons. At 4:30 p.m., as the autumn sun began to dip below the horizon, Martha kissed her granddaughter goodbye and watched from the porch as Clara skipped down the sidewalk, her little backpack bouncing on her shoulders. Clara never made it home. When 5:15 p.m. came and went without Clara walking to the door, her mother, Susan Whitmore, felt the first flutter of panic. By 5:45 p.m., that flutter had become a scream. Susan called Martha, who confirmed Clara had left over an hour ago. The 4-block walk should have taken 10 minutes at most. Susan ran outside, calling Clara's name. Her voice echoed down the empty streets. Neighbors emerged from their homes, drawn by the desperation in her cries. Within minutes, dozens of people were searching, checking backyards, peering into parked cars, knocking on doors. By 7 p.m., police sirens pierced the quiet evening air. Officers flooded the neighborhood with flashlights and search dogs. The Whitmore family's modest 2-story home became command central, with police radios crackling and neighbors bringing coffee and sandwiches no one could eat. Susan sat on the couch, her hands trembling, while Clara's father, Robert, paced back and forth, running his hands through his hair, unable to comprehend how his daughter could simply disappear. The route between the 2 houses was searched inch by inch. The sidewalk Clara would have walked showed no signs of struggle. No torn clothing, no dropped items, no witnesses who remembered seeing anything unusual. It was as if she had simply evaporated into thin air. By midnight, the temperature had dropped, and Clara was out there somewhere, if she was still alive, in nothing but her pink jacket and white sneakers. The search expanded to the woods at the edge of town, to abandoned buildings, to the creek where children sometimes played. Volunteers formed human chains, moving slowly through the darkness, calling her name into the void. The candlelight vigil that first night drew over 300 people. They stood in the town square, holding flickering flames against the wind, praying for a little girl most of them had never met. Susan couldn't attend. She refused to leave the house, convinced Clara would come home at any moment and find her mother gone. Days turned into weeks. Missing posters with Clara's smiling face appeared on every telephone pole, in every shop window, at every gas station for 50 miles. Her photo was broadcast on local news, then state news, then national news. Tips flooded in from across the country, possible sightings that led nowhere, conspiracy theories, psychics claiming to know where she was. Every single lead was investigated. Every single lead came up empty. The town of Millbrook changed that autumn. Parents no longer let their children walk alone. Doors that had never known locks suddenly had deadbolts. Suspicion crept into every conversation. Neighbors eyed each other differently, wondering if the person they'd waved to for years could be hiding something dark. But the truth about what happened that night didn't die with the people who searched for her. It was just buried deeply. Detective Harold Green had been with the Millbrook Police Department for 15 years when Clara Whitmore disappeared. He'd handled robberies, domestic disputes, even a few assaults, but he'd never worked a missing child case. Nothing in his training had prepared him for the desperation in Susan Whitmore's eyes or the helplessness that came with each day that passed without answers. Green threw himself into the investigation with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He interviewed every resident within a mile radius of Clara's route. He questioned teachers, shopkeepers, the mailman, even the priest at St. Michael's Church. He reviewed phone records, checked alibis, and followed up on every tip, no matter how absurd it seemed. The initial suspect pool was painfully small. Millbrook had no registered sex offenders. No strangers had been reported in the area. The most promising lead came from a neighbor who remembered seeing a dark blue sedan parked on Oak Street around the time Clara would have been walking home. But dozens of people in town owned dark blue sedans, and none of them had any connection to Clara. The first real heartbreak came when police discovered Clara's backpack 3 weeks after her disappearance. A hunter found it in the woods, about 2 miles from town, partially hidden under fallen leaves. Inside were coloring books, a half-eaten granola bar, and a drawing she'd made for her mother, a crayon portrait of their family holding hands under a rainbow. But there was no other trace of Clara. No footprints, no clothing, no signs of a struggle. The backpack appeared to have been deliberately placed there, as if to send a message. She had been taken, and she wasn't coming back. The discovery shattered what little hope remained. The town's bulletin board was plastered with her photo. Each day, the sun faded the colors a little more, Clara's bright blue eyes turning pale, her smile becoming ghostly, as if she was slowly disappearing even from memory. The Whitmore family began to unravel. Robert, who worked construction, stopped going to his job. He spent his days driving around town, searching the same streets over and over, as if sheer determination could make his daughter reappear. At night, he sat in Clara's room, surrounded by her toys and books, unable to accept that she was gone. Susan took a different path. She became convinced that Clara was still alive, being held somewhere, waiting to be rescued. She organized search parties every weekend, long after the official search had been called off. She plastered new missing posters over the faded ones, refreshing Clara's image in the public consciousness. She called Detective Green every single day, asking if there had been any developments, any new leads, anything at all. The marriage couldn't withstand the grief. By the second year, accusations started flying. Robert blamed Susan for letting Clara walk alone. Susan blamed Robert for not being home that day. They blamed themselves. They blamed God. They blamed the police for not finding their daughter. The blame had to go somewhere, because the alternative, that Clara had simply been stolen by random cruelty and chance, was too terrible to accept. They separated in 1985. Robert moved to Ohio, unable to bear living in a house where Clara's empty bedroom stood as a constant reminder. Susan refused to move. She stayed in that house for the rest of her life, keeping Clara's room exactly as it had been, convinced that one day her daughter would walk through the door and need to find everything waiting for her. Detective Green's obsession deepened as the years passed. He kept the case file on his desk long after it had been officially designated as cold. He reviewed the evidence over and over, convinced he was missing something. The dark blue sedan, the backpack in the woods, the complete absence of witnesses. It didn't add up to a random kidnapping. It felt planned, methodical. He developed a theory that Clara had been targeted, possibly watched for weeks before she was taken. He believed whoever took her knew her routine, knew exactly when she'd be walking home alone, knew the 4-block route would provide a small window of opportunity. But without evidence, his theory remained just that, a theory. 5 years after Clara disappeared, in 1987, a breakthrough seemed to arrive. Construction workers excavating for a new shopping center on the outskirts of Millbrook discovered a shallow grave. Inside was the body of a young girl, approximately the same age Clara would have been when she vanished. The town held its breath as DNA testing, still a relatively new technology, was conducted. The results came back negative. The DNA didn't match Clara Whitmore. The body was eventually identified as belonging to another missing child from a different state, a different tragedy that had its own devastated family. But the question that haunted Detective Green and everyone who'd searched for Clara remained. If that body wasn't Clara, then where was she? And more disturbingly, who was buried in that shallow grave, and how many other children had disappeared without anyone connecting the cases? By the early 1990s, Clara Whitmore's disappearance had faded from the public consciousness. New tragedies captured headlines. New missing children appeared on milk cartons. Life in Millbrook moved forward, as it always does, even when it shouldn't. Detective Harold Green retired in 1993, but he couldn't let go. His basement became an unofficial archive of the Clara Whitmore investigation. Boxes of files, witness statements, maps with red circles and question marks, photographs of Clara smiling at the camera, unaware that her life would be cut short. Green's wife complained that he spent more time in that basement than he did with his family. She wasn't wrong. Green had become convinced that Clara's disappearance was connected to something larger. He started researching similar cases from the early 1980s. Children who had vanished without a trace. Cases that had gone cold. Families that had never received answers. He found patterns that disturbed him. Children taken during brief windows of opportunity. Minimal evidence left behind. No witnesses. No bodies ever found. He wrote letters to police departments across Pennsylvania, then across the country, trying to establish connections. Most of his letters went unanswered. The few responses he received were polite but dismissive, without concrete evidence linking the cases. There was nothing to investigate. Susan Whitmore passed away in 1996, 14 years after her daughter disappeared. She died in the same house, in the same bedroom, having never learned what happened to Clara. Her obituary mentioned that she was survived by her son, Thomas, and preceded in death by her daughter, Clara, whose case remained unsolved. The local newspaper ran a small article remembering the case, but it generated little interest. The town had moved on. Thomas Whitmore, Clara's older brother, had been 11 when his sister vanished. He remembered everything about that day. Coming home from school to find his mother hysterical. The police everywhere. The way his childhood ended in a single afternoon. By the 1990s, Thomas was middle-aged, living in Philadelphia, working as an accountant. He rarely spoke about his sister. What was there to say that hadn't been said 1,000 times? But he carried the weight of her absence every day. He thought about her when he saw children playing in parks. He wondered what she would have looked like grown up, what her voice would have sounded like, whether they would have been close. He felt guilty for the times he'd been annoyed with her when they were children, for the times he'd refused to play with her because she was too young, too bothersome. He'd give anything to be annoyed by her again. The case resurfaced briefly in 2002 when a local filmmaker produced a documentary about unsolved disappearances in Pennsylvania. The Vanished Children featured Clara's case prominently, interviewing Detective Green Thomas and several neighbors who remembered that October evening. The documentary raised new questions but provided no new answers. It did, however, spark a wave of speculation and rumors. Online forums dedicated to true crime picked up the case. Armchair detectives proposed theories ranging from the plausible to the absurd. Some believed Clara had been taken by a child trafficking ring. Others suggested she'd been abducted by a cult that had been operating in rural Pennsylvania during the 1980s. A few claimed she'd been taken by a family member, despite no evidence supporting that theory. The most disturbing rumor suggested that several witnesses had seen something suspicious that day but had been silenced or paid off. According to this theory, someone with power or influence had been involved in Clara's disappearance, and evidence had been deliberately suppressed. Detective Green found these rumors particularly interesting because they aligned with his own suspicions, though he'd never been able to prove anything. The documentary generated renewed media attention for about 6 months, then faded away like everything else. By 2005, Clara Whitmore was a footnote in Pennsylvania's history of unsolved cases. Her name appeared in databases and cold case files, but no active investigation was ongoing. The people who'd known her personally were aging or dying. The town of Millbrook barely remembered the little girl who'd vanished 23 years earlier. For Thomas Whitmore, now in his early 30s, hope had become a form of torture. Part of him wanted to know the truth, no matter how terrible. Another part of him feared that truth, feared what it would confirm about the world and the cruelty humans were capable of. He lived in a state of permanent limbo, unable to grieve properly because without a body, without confirmation, some small part of him still wondered if Clara might somehow, impossibly, be alive. Detective Green died in 2008, taking his obsession with him to the grave. His basement files were eventually cleared out by his children, who donated most of it to the local historical society. The Clara Whitmore case remained unsolved, seemingly destined to stay that way forever. But fate works in mysterious ways. Sometimes justice waits decades. Sometimes truth remains hidden until the right person asks the right question. Sometimes the past doesn't stay buried, until one woman, thousands of miles away, would unknowingly reopen the case decades later. The year 2065 looked nothing like the 1980s. Flying cars hadn't materialized, but technology had advanced in ways that would seem like magic to someone from Clara Whitmore's era. DNA testing had evolved from a tool used only in criminal investigations to a consumer product that anyone could order online. Genealogy databases contain the genetic information of millions of people, mapping family trees and uncovering secrets that have been buried for generations. Eleanor Pierce was 79 years old, living in a quiet retirement community outside Portland, Oregon. She'd had a good life, married for 47 years before her husband passed, 2 grown children, 5 grandchildren, and a small garden that gave her purpose in her golden years. She'd been a librarian, a profession that suited her love of organization and stories. Eleanor had never given much thought to her ancestry. She knew the basics. Her mother had been a single woman who'd raised her alone, telling Eleanor that her father had died before she was born. Her mother, Margaret, had passed away in 2001, taking whatever secrets she had with her. Eleanor had no extended family that she knew of, no cousins or aunts or uncles. It had always been just the 2 of them. When Eleanor's daughter suggested taking a DNA test to trace their family heritage, Eleanor agreed mostly to humor her. It seemed like a fun project, something to give her grandchildren a sense of their roots. She ordered the kit, swabbed her cheek, and mailed it back, not expecting much more than confirmation of her European ancestry. 6 weeks later, she received a notification that would change everything. Possible match, Whitmore family, Pennsylvania. Relationship, extremely close maternal match. Confidence level, 99.7%. Eleanor stared at the screen, confused. She'd never heard of any Whitmore family. She'd certainly never been to Pennsylvania, except for a brief vacation to Philadelphia decades ago. She clicked on the notification, hoping for more information. What she found was a message from someone named Dr. Marin Soto, a forensic genealogist who worked with law enforcement to solve cold cases using genetic genealogy. The message was polite but urgent. Ms. Pierce, my name is Dr. Marin Soto. I'm a forensic genealogist working with the Pennsylvania State Police. Your DNA has been flagged as a potential match to evidence from a missing person case from 1982. I understand this may be confusing, but it's extremely important that we speak as soon as possible. Please contact me at your earliest convenience. Eleanor read the message 3 times, her heart pounding. A missing person case from 1982? She would have been alive then. She'd been 17 years old in 1982, living with her mother in New Mexico. How could she possibly be connected to a missing person from Pennsylvania? She called her daughter first, who urged her to reach out to Dr. Soto immediately. Mom, this could be important. Maybe you have relatives you didn't know about. Maybe someone in our family went missing and you could help find them. Eleanor made the call, her hands trembling as she dialed the number. Dr. Maren Soto was a woman in her mid-40s who'd made a career out of solving the unsolvable. She'd used genetic genealogy to identify dozens of cold case victims and perpetrators, bringing closure to families who'd waited decades for answers. The Whitmore case had landed on her desk 6 months earlier when Pennsylvania State Police began uploading old DNA evidence to genealogy databases, hoping to catch a break on cases that predated modern investigative techniques. When Eleanor's DNA pinged as a match to the Whitmore case, Dr. Soto nearly dropped her coffee. The match percentage was unusually high, suggesting a parent-child or sibling relationship. But Clara Whitmore had been 5 years old when she disappeared. She couldn't have had a child, and her only sibling, Thomas, had already been tested years ago as part of the investigation. Dr. Soto spent the next 2 weeks tracing Eleanor Pierce's lineage, working backward through birth certificates, adoption records, marriage licenses, and census data. What she found, or rather, what she didn't find, was deeply troubling. Eleanor's birth certificate showed she was born in Albuquerque, New Mexico, in 1986. But when Dr. Soto dug deeper, she couldn't find any hospital records of Eleanor's birth. No prenatal care records from Margaret Pierce. No photographs of Margaret pregnant. It was as if Eleanor had simply appeared in Margaret's life as a 3-year-old child in 1989. Dr. Soto found something else, an unmarked adoption record from 1985, filed in Arizona, involving a woman matching Margaret Pierce's description and a 3-year-old girl. The record had been sealed, which was unusual but not unheard of. What was unusual was that the adoption had been processed through a private agency that no longer existed, an agency that had been shut down in 1992 amid allegations of irregularities. When Dr. Soto finally spoke with Eleanor on the phone, she chose her words carefully. "Ms. Pierce, I need to ask you something that may seem strange. What do you know about your adoption?" Eleanor went silent. "My adoption? I wasn't adopted. My mother gave birth to me." "Ms. Pierce, I've been researching your background, and I found records that suggest you may have been adopted as a young child, around 1985 or 1986. Did your mother ever discuss this with you?" Eleanor's world tilted. "That's not possible. My mother would have told me." She would have. But even as she spoke, memories surfaced. The lack of baby photos. Her mother's vague answers about Eleanor's early childhood. The way Margaret had always changed the subject when Eleanor asked about extended family. "There's something else," Dr. Soto continued gently. "Your DNA is a very close match to a little girl named Clara Whitmore who disappeared in Pennsylvania in 1982. The match suggests you're either closely related to her or—" Dr. Soto paused, unsure how to phrase the impossible. "Ms. Pierce, would you be willing to provide another DNA sample for more detailed testing? I know this is overwhelming, but we may be on the verge of solving a case that's haunted a family for over 8 decades. Eleanor agreed, though she felt like she was moving through a dream. A case from 1982. A little girl who disappeared. A connection that shouldn't exist. She thought she was taking a test to learn about her roots. She had no idea she was about to rewrite history. Dr. Maren Soto worked with intensity she'd rarely felt before. The Eleanor Pierce case wasn't just another cold case investigation. It was something unprecedented, something that defied logical explanation. She coordinated with Pennsylvania State Police, the FBI's Genetic Genealogy Unit, and several independent laboratories to ensure the DNA testing was beyond reproach. Eleanor's second sample was analyzed using the most advanced genetic sequencing technology available in 2065. The results took 3 weeks to process, 3 weeks during which Eleanor barely slept. She begun her own investigation, going through her late mother's belongings that she kept in storage, looking for anything that might explain the impossible. What she found was troubling. No medical records from her early childhood, gaps in documentation, photographs that showed her as a 3-year-old but none younger. Her mother had always said the earlier photos had been lost in a fire, but now Eleanor wondered if they never existed at all. When Dr. Soto called with the results, her voice was shaking slightly, something Eleanor had never heard during their previous conversations. Eleanor, the DNA is a match, a near-perfect maternal match to Clara Whitmore. But there's a problem. Dr. Soto paused, choosing her words carefully. Clara Whitmore disappeared in 1982. You were born, or at least you appeared in records, in 1986. Clara was 5 years old when she vanished. The math doesn't work. It's scientifically impossible for you to be Clara's daughter or sister. Then what am I? Eleanor asked, her voice barely a whisper. That's what we need to figure out. The Pennsylvania State Police officially reopened the Clara Whitmore case in February 2065, 83 years after her disappearance. Thomas Whitmore had passed away in 2045, never knowing what happened to his sister. But his children, Clara's nieces and nephews who'd never met her, still lived in Pennsylvania. They were contacted and agreed to provide DNA samples for comparison. The results confirmed what the initial testing had shown. Eleanor Pierce was genetically related to the Whitmore family through Clara, but the relationship couldn't be defined in conventional terms. She wasn't Clara's daughter. She wasn't a cousin or niece. The genetic markers suggested something else entirely, something that made no scientific sense. Dr. Soto brought in a team of geneticists and forensic specialists. They reviewed the data dozens of times, looking for errors in the lab work, contamination of samples, any explanation that would make sense. There were no errors. The DNA was legitimate. One of the geneticists, Dr. Raymond Chun, proposed something that sounded like science fiction. What if Eleanor isn't descended from Clara? What if she is Clara, genetically speaking? The room went silent. That's not possible, another scientist objected. Clara would be 88 years old if she were alive. Eleanor is 79. I'm not saying Eleanor is literally Clara, Dr. Chin continued. I'm saying her DNA is identical to Clara's in ways that suggest genetic replication. Cloning. The word hung in the air like a bomb. Cloning in the 1980s had been theoretical at best. Dolly, the sheep wouldn't be cloned until 1996. Human cloning was considered science fiction, the realm of movies and novels, not reality. But what if someone had been experimenting with genetic replication decades before it became public knowledge? What if Clara Whitmore hadn't just been kidnapped? What if she'd been taken for research purposes? Dr. Soto began investigating from a new angle. She looked into research facilities that had operated in the Northeast during the 1980s, particularly those involved in genetic research or fertility treatments. She combed through declassified government documents, academic papers, and news articles about controversial medical experiments. What she found was disturbing. In the 1970s and 1980s, several privately funded research facilities had operated in Pennsylvania, New York, and New Jersey, conducting experiments that pushed the boundaries of medical ethics. Some were investigating fertility treatments. Others were exploring genetic therapies. Oversight was minimal. Documentation was sparse. One facility in particular caught her attention, the Horizon Biomedical Center, which had operated from 1978 to 1987 in rural Pennsylvania, less than 50 miles from Millbrook. The facility had been shut down abruptly amid rumors of ethical violations, though no charges were ever filed. The building had been demolished in 1990, and most records had been destroyed or sealed. Dr. Soto filed Freedom of Information Act requests, pulling at every thread she could find. After months of bureaucratic delays, she received a partial file from a government archive. Inside were fragments of documents related to Horizon Biomedical, enough to piece together a horrifying picture. The facility had been conducting unauthorized experiments on human genetic material. They'd been exploring early cloning techniques, genetic modification, and cellular regeneration. And according to one document, they had access to juvenile subjects for their research. Juvenile subjects. Children. Dr. Soto found something else in those documents. Audio recordings from Detective Harold Green's investigation. Recordings that had been suppressed. In one audio file from 1985, Green interviewed a former employee of Horizon Biomedical who'd contacted him anonymously. The quality was poor, but his words were clear. They were taking children. Not directly. They had people who did that part. They disguised as adoption, foster care, medical treatment for sick kids whose parents couldn't afford care. But these kids weren't sick. They were being used for experiments. Genetic experiments. I left because I couldn't be part of it anymore. But I can't come forward officially. They have connections. Government connections. They'll bury me in the evidence. Green's voice on the recording. Do you know the names of any of these children? The man's response was partially inaudible, damaged by time and poor recording quality. But one phrase came through clearly. Blonde girl. 5 years old, taken in 82. The recording ended there. Dr. Soto found notes Green had made. Source disappeared before I could follow up. Could not verify claims. Attempted to investigate Horizon Biomedical, but was ordered to cease by superiors. Reason given, national security. Case remains unsolved. The truth was emerging from decades of silence. Clara Whitmore had been kidnapped by a random predator. She'd been taken by a research facility that was conducting illegal genetic experiments. And Eleanor Pierce wasn't just linked to Clara. She was a result of those experiments, a genetic replica of Clara Whitmore, created through cloning technology that wasn't supposed to exist in the 1980s. But that revelation led to an even more disturbing question. If Eleanor was a clone of Clara, what happened to Clara herself? Where was the original little girl? And how many other children had been taken by Horizon Biomedical for their experiments? The woman who raised Eleanor wasn't her real mother. She was part of a nationwide network that vanished children and falsified identities. The investigation expanded rapidly once the Horizon Biomedical connection was established. Federal agencies got involved, FBI, Department of Health and Human Services, even a special congressional committee that had been formed in the 2040s to investigate historical government misconduct in medical research. The case of Clara Whitmore and Eleanor Pierce became headline news across the country. Eleanor found herself at the center of a media storm. Reporters camped outside her home in Oregon. Her photo appeared on every major news outlet. She was simultaneously a victim and a miracle of science, a woman who lived a normal life without knowing she was evidence of crimes committed before she was born. The psychological impact was devastating. Eleanor had to grapple with the reality that the woman she called mother for 79 years had either been complicit in illegal experiments or had been deceived herself. Margaret Pierce had died in 2001, taking her secrets to the grave. Eleanor would never get answers directly from her. Dr. Soto continued digging, and what she uncovered was conspiracy that stretched far beyond a single research facility. Through preserved hospital records, financial documents, and declassified government memos, she pieced together the operation. Horizon Biomedical had been funded through a series of shell corporations that trace back to a Department of Defense black budget program. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, the U.S. government had been exploring genetic engineering as part of military research, hoping to create enhanced soldiers or medical breakthroughs that would give America an advantage in the Cold War. The research was classified, conducted through private contractors to maintain plausible deniability. Horizon Biomedical was one of several facilities involved in this research. They'd been granted extraordinary freedom to experiment because national security was at stake. Oversight was minimal because the work was too sensitive for normal regulatory review. Ethics committees were either circumvented or stacked with people who would approve anything in the name of progress. The facility needed subjects, specifically children, whose genetic material was more malleable and whose disappearances might not be thoroughly investigated if the children came from the right circumstances. They couldn't simply abduct random children from wealthy families. That would draw too much attention. Instead, they targeted vulnerable populations, children in foster care, children from poor families, children who wouldn't be extensively searched for if they vanished. But Clara Whitmore didn't fit that profile. She'd been from a stable, loving family. Her disappearance had generated massive attention and a thorough investigation. So why had she been taken? Dr. Soto found the answer in genetic records that had been preserved in a secure government archive. Clara Whitmore had possessed a rare genetic marker, a natural mutation that made her cells particularly resilient and adaptable. She'd been identified during a routine medical screening at school, part of a public health initiative that was actually a cover for identifying potential subjects for genetic research. Clara had been taken because her genes were valuable. Her DNA showed potential for breakthroughs in cellular regeneration and disease resistance. To the researchers at Horizon Biomedical, she wasn't a child with a family who loved her. She was specimen C-147, a source of genetic material for experiments that could advance human science by decades. The most chilling discovery came from laboratory notes dated 1983 to 1986. The researchers had successfully extracted Clara's genetic material and used early cloning techniques, more advanced than anything publicly available at the time, to create multiple genetic replicas. These replicas were gestated in artificial wombs, a technology that wouldn't become publicly available until the 2030s. Of the 5 clones attempted, only one survived to full term, Eleanor. The notes described disposal of the failed clones. They described Eleanor as viable subject E001 and noted that she would be placed with an operative, Margaret Pierce, who would raise her as a normal child, unaware of her origins. The purpose was to study the long-term development of a clone human in a natural environment, to see if Eleanor would develop normally or show anomalies. Eleanor was both a victim and an experiment, a human being who'd been created in a laboratory and planted into the world to be observed from a distance. Margaret Pierce had been paid generously to raise Eleanor and provide regular reports on her development. Reports she disguised as letters to a medical charity that Eleanor had found in her mother's belongings. But what about Clara? What happened to the original little girl? The answer came from a single page buried in the archive files, dated December 1984, 2 years after Clara's disappearance. It was a death certificate, issued internally at Horizon Biomedical, never filed with any official government agency. Subject C-147. Date of death, December 3, 1984. Cause, multiple organ failure following extended genetic harvesting procedures. Subject was cremated per protocol. No remains were preserved. Clara Whitmore had died at age 7, her body used up by the researchers who'd taken her. She'd been kept alive for 2 years as a source of genetic material before her organs finally gave out. She died in a laboratory, probably terrified, probably calling for her mother, while Eleanor, her genetic twin, was being prepared for placement with Margaret Pierce. Eleanor read the death certificate and felt her world shatter. She wasn't just connected to Clara Whitmore. She was Clara Whitmore, genetically speaking. Every cell in her body carried Clara's DNA. But Clara had been tortured and killed to create her. Eleanor's entire existence was built on the murder of a child. The revelation broke her. For weeks, she couldn't eat or sleep. She stared at photographs of Clara, photographs that showed a face that could have been her own at that age, and felt crushing guilt. She hadn't asked to be created. She lived a good life, loved her family, worked hard, contributed to society. But her life had been purchased with Clara's suffering. Through slow, painful healing, Eleanor began to understand something crucial. She wasn't responsible for what happened to Clara. She was a victim, too, a child created without consent, raised on lies, used as a subject in an experiment that spanned decades. Clara's death wasn't her fault. The guilt belonged to the researchers, the government officials who'd authorized the program, the people who'd valued scientific advancement over human life. Dr. Soto worked with Eleanor to ensure the truth would be documented completely. The story needed to be told for Clara, for Eleanor, for all the victims of Horizon Biomedical and similar facilities. The investigation revealed that at least 37 other children had been taken by the network between 1979 and 1987. Some were used for genetic experiments. Others were trafficked through illegal adoptions. A few were never identified. Eleanor thought she was taking a test to learn about her roots. She had no idea she was about to rewrite history. But she wasn't just rewriting history. She was giving Clara Whitmore justice, a voice, proof that she'd existed and mattered. Eleanor wasn't the same child. She was a genetically replicated clone of Clara, raised under a new identity after the research was covered up. The final pieces of the puzzle fell into place in late 2065, when Dr. Marin Soto uncovered evidence that Detective Harold Green's warnings and discoveries had been deliberately suppressed at the highest levels. Green had been closer to the truth than anyone realized. His investigation in the mid-1980s had identified Horizon Biomedical as suspicious. He'd interviewed the whistleblower, found connections between missing children in the facility, and begun building a case. But when he'd tried to pursue it officially, he'd been blocked at every turn. Dr. Soto obtained Green's complete investigative file through a court order, including documents that had been classified for decades. What she found was a paper trail of obstruction, orders from state police superiors to drop the Horizon Biomedical angle, threats to Green's pension if he continued investigating, and eventually a direct visit from federal agents who told him that pursuing the case further would be considered a matter of national security and potential treason. Green had been forced to choose between his career and the truth. He'd chosen his career, but the guilt had eaten at him for the rest of his life. His basement obsession hadn't been about solving the case. It had been about preserving evidence, documenting what he'd found, hoping that someday, when enough time had passed and the powerful people protecting Horizon Biomedical were dead or retired, someone would uncover the truth. That someone was Dr. Soto, and that someday was now. The investigation revealed names. People who'd authorized the program, scientists who conducted the experiments, government officials who provided cover. Most were dead by 2065. Some were in their 90s, facing prosecution for crimes committed when they'd been ambitious young researchers or bureaucrats willing to bend ethics in the name of progress. 3 individuals were still alive and mentally competent to stand trial. Dr. Vincent Marlowe, the lead geneticist at Horizon Biomedical, was 94 years old, living in a nursing home in Florida. Angela Trent, who'd run the child trafficking operation that supplied subjects to the facility, was 90 years old, living quietly in Arizona under a different name. And Richard Kellerman, a former Defense Department official who'd authorized funding and provided protection for the program, was 96, still sharp-minded despite his age. The trials began in early 2066. Eleanor attended every day, sitting in the front row, staring at the people who'd stolen Clara's life and created her own. The prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence: documents, recordings, testimony from former employees, genetic analysis. The defense attorneys argued that their client had been acting under government orders, that the research had been legal at the time under classified protocols, that prosecuting elderly people for decades-old crimes was cruel. The jury didn't buy it. Dr. Marlowe was convicted of murder, kidnapping, and conspiracy. He died in prison 6 months later. Angela Trent was convicted of child trafficking and conspiracy. She was sentenced to life in prison. Richard Kellerman was convicted of conspiracy and criminal negligence. He was sentenced to 20 years. But the convictions, while satisfying, didn't bring Clara back. They didn't undo what had been done to her, or the other 37 children identified as victims. They didn't erase the fact that the U.S. government had funded and protected crimes against children in the name of scientific advancement. Eleanor struggled with how to honor Clara's memory. She wasn't Clara. She had her own identity, her own life story. But she carried Clara's DNA, Clara's genetic legacy. In a strange way, Clara lived on through her, though not in the way anyone would have chosen. She decided to visit Millbrook, Pennsylvania, the town where Clara had grown up and vanished. It was June 2066, 84 years after that October afternoon, when a little girl had skipped down the sidewalk and never made it home. Millbrook had changed dramatically. The working-class town had become a suburb, with new housing developments and shopping centers. But the old neighborhood where the Whitmore family had lived still existed, though many of the houses had been renovated or rebuilt. Eleanor stood in front of what had once been the Whitmore home. It was abandoned now, scheduled for demolition to make way for a new apartment complex. The windows were boarded up, the yard overgrown. But she could imagine it as it had been, a modest two-story house where a family had lived and loved and lost everything. She walked the route Clara would have taken from her grandmother's house. 4 blocks. It took her less than 10 minutes. Such a short distance for such a profound tragedy. At the spot where Clara's backpack had been found, now part of a nature preserve, Eleanor placed a bouquet of wildflowers. She brought a photograph, too, one of Clara smiling at the camera, and she set it against a tree, protected in a plastic frame. "I'm sorry," Eleanor whispered to the photo, to the little girl who died terrified and alone. "I'm sorry they did this to you. I'm sorry you never got to grow up, never got to have the life you deserved. I'll live well enough for both of us. I promise." She sat there for a long time, listening to birds singing, feeling the summer sun on her face. Clara had never experienced her teenage years, never fallen in love, never traveled or pursued dreams or had children of her own. But Eleanor had. Eleanor had lived a life Clara never could, and she would honor that gift by living fully, consciously, gratefully. The case sparked national conversations about government accountability, the ethics of genetic research, and the need for oversight in classified programs. Laws were passed requiring regular review of all classified medical research, with independent ethics boards that couldn't be circumvented. Victims' families received compensation, money that couldn't undo the harm but acknowledged it. Thomas Whitmore's children, Clara's nieces and nephews, met Eleanor. The first meeting was awkward, emotional, surreal. They looked at Eleanor and saw their aunt in her features, her expressions, the shape of her eyes. Eleanor looked at them and saw the family Clara had been stolen from, the cousins she might have had. They became friends, not because they had to, but because they chose to. They shared stories. The Whitmore descendants telling Eleanor about Clara's short life, the family history she'd never known, and Eleanor sharing what it felt like to discover her origins, to carry the DNA of someone who'd been loved and lost. Detective Harold Green's name was cleared posthumously. The Millbrook Police Department issued a formal apology for the way he'd been silenced and honored him with a memorial plaque acknowledging his dedication to truth and justice. His basement files, which had preserved crucial evidence, were donated to the National Criminal Justice Museum. Susan and Robert Whitmore never knew what happened to their daughter, but their story became part of the public record. Documentaries were made. Books were written. Clara Whitmore's face appeared not just on missing posters, but in history books, a symbol of the children who'd been failed by systems that should have protected them. Eleanor lived to be 92 years old, passing away peacefully in 2078. In her final years, she'd become an advocate for victims of unethical research, speaking at conferences and universities, ensuring that Clara's story and her own would never be forgotten. When she died, her obituary mentioned that she was a genetic daughter of Clara Whitmore, a child who disappeared in 1982 and whose case had finally been solved 8 decades later. She was buried in Millbrook, next to a memorial that had been erected for Clara. The headstones stood side by side, one marking the life that had been stolen, the other marking the life that had been created from that theft. Different people, different stories, but connected forever by DNA and tragedy and ultimate justice. The case of Clara Whitmore proved something important. That time doesn't erase truth. It only delays it. That secrets kept by powerful people eventually come to light. That justice, while slow, can still arrive. That children who are taken are never truly forgotten, because their absence leaves scars that last generations. She never knew the life she was meant to live, but her DNA carried the truth across a century, preserved in a body that science had created and conscience had finally revealed. Sometimes the past doesn't rest. Sometimes it waits to be rediscovered. And sometimes when we dig deep enough, when we refuse to let cold cases stay cold, when we honor the missing by never giving up, we find that the truth was there all along, waiting for someone brave enough to uncover it. Clara Whitmore vanished in 1982, but 83 years later, a DNA test proved she was never truly gone. Her story, her DNA, her legacy lived on, in the woman who'd never known her but carried her genes, in the family that never stopped grieving, in the detective who never stopped searching, and in all of us who believe that every missing child deserved to be found, even if it takes a lifetime. If you think justice should never expire, remember Clara Whitmore. Remember that behind every cold case is a person who mattered, a family that suffered, and a truth that deserves to be told, no matter how long it takes.